Listen, earlier today I was reflecting on God's loving kindness, but not only God's loving kindness, but the peace that surpasses all that comes from our affiliation with God. Again, how God has planted in the souls of all of our existence, God's loving kindness. We have examples of that throughout our day to day. And again, the peace that surpasses all understanding, just because of our affiliation with God. Greetings and blessings to those of you who have paused and made the decision to join us here at the noonday hour. Of course, I bring you greetings from our national president, Mr. Jerry Redmond, and of course, the president of the university, Dr. Gerald Briggs. My name is Reverend Anthony J. Brownlow, and I am the national chaplain for the Alumni Association. Well, last week, we had a conversation in and around, does Exodus mean liberation? And that supporting text was Exodus, the 12th chapter, the 31st to the 33rd verses. Well, this week, we'll find ourselves in Genesis, and the topic is how to get an audience with the king. Again, how to get an audience with the king. And the supporting text is Genesis, the 41st chapter, verses 9 through 13. And the text reads as follows. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted it for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Again, how to get an audience with the king. So, what I've come to realize just off of living is you don't, where you start doesn't necessarily mean that's where you're going to end. And that really resonated with me as I kind of perused the text, particularly all of the 41st chapter. And so what came to mind were two other characters in the biblical story. Nehemiah, who is one of my favorite characters, came to mind at the outset because this is someone who had an audience with the king. But his story is a little different than Joseph in this moment. Nehemiah, of course, and the book of Nehemiah finds himself as the cupbearer for the king. However, Nehemiah is a child of the exit. He's a child of Babylonian captivity. He actually never lived in the southern kingdom. In fact, he's a child of exile. He was born in Babylon, but what is really interesting is Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king at the time that Babylon attacks the southern kingdom, actually made an executive decision or a strategic decision to neutralize or paralyze Jerusalem and the southern kingdom. And how did he do so? He made a decision to take their best of the best back to Babylon. In fact, I call it a brain drain. And so, of course, by doing so, he takes Nehemiah's parents, and therefore Nehemiah is born into Babylon. And so in turn, he, at the outset, is exceptional, right? And so, of course, you could kind of imagine, even though he is of Hebrew origin, he finds himself next to the king. Now, that's Nehemiah. But then, there is Moses, of course, name via Egyptian is born, but that same name with the Hebrew context is to draw out. Of course, Moses is placed in the Nile, ends up being pulled out of the Nile or drawn out of the Nile by the Pharaoh's sister, and is actually raised in the house of Pharaoh until he makes the executive decision to kill an Egyptian because of the oppressive or the abusive nature of this particular Egyptian in the lives of those captive Hebrews. And he is sent to his own wilderness, but then he is brought back, of course, to Egypt to be an advocate, to be a leader, to get them out of Egypt itself, the Exodus, correct? And here we find ourselves with Joseph. Of course, this story starts at the 37th chapter of Genesis, and it proceeds from the 37th chapter all the way to the end of Genesis at chapter 50. And so it was interesting to see the things that were transpiring in the life of Joseph from chapter 37. We take a pause break at 38, and we commence the story again in 39 through 50. And so what happens is kind of amazing. And so, if we want to sit down and contemplate or consider how do you get an audience with a king, I think there's some things we have to factor in. First, of course, I mentioned this text actually, the story of Joseph starts at the 37th chapter. But then there's a pause break there at 38 that, is dropped in, and it talks about Judah, his brother, who actually was one of the lead proponents for dropping him into the pit to be sold off into enslavement. And then the story commences again in chapter 39. But one of the things that hit me as I sat back and I looked at Joseph's life, you have to believe the dream which is placed in your heart, because that's what happens. That's what kind of gets the ball rolling in the life of Joseph. He's a dreamer, of course. And you have to believe your dream, right? And even when there are family members who actually discount your dream, their friends, whomever, that kind of discount your dream, you have to keep that dream in your heart and in your mind. That's one way, that's kind of like the initiating, I would suggest, means of moving you in the direction of getting an audience with the king. But not only that, despite the changes of seasons that you find yourself sort of wrestling with, because we get to this point whereas Joseph is actually thrown into a pit by his own brothers. And so, of course, that has to be traumatic, of course, disappointing. But it's this whole moment of, think life happens, right? But you have to keep your dream in your heart and in your mind, despite what is happening. And I'm sure we can all relate to this one thing, where we have made a request from God and we find ourselves in this season where it feels like we're in a holding pattern. And so that's how I kind of took the 38th chapter, because all of a sudden the story literally stops talking about Joseph and it talks about his brother, Judah, and his wife, Tamar, and that whole dilemma that transpires there. And so it's almost like a pause break. And I'm sure sometimes we all feel like we've had a pause break. I can share with you that, hey, there have been moments when I've made requests and only for it to feel like someone is basically ignoring me. But lo and behold, that same individual a month later pops back on the radar and says, "Hey, I apologize. Um, I just, had some things going on at work, in my personal life, this, that, and the third." And that was a pause break. And so sometimes I think we all have to wrestle with those pause breaks and consider, like, hey, that doesn't mean just because we're not seeing what we desire to see in that particular season, that doesn't mean that we're not going to achieve that which we desire or that which we are pursuing. It just means it is a pause break. There's some variables getting aligned for you. And then thirdly, you might be lied upon. You might be mistreated because, this story with Joseph, this whole situation with Potiphar's wife, who lies on him about, him attempting to rape her. Like, this whole thing is extremely entertaining. And I'm sure we've all had situations where we felt like we were unfairly mistreated, and things didn't unfold in a fashion that was pleasing to us, and it took an emotional kind of like toll on us. And so Joseph is telling us and encouraging us by his walk through this particular story to keep moving forward, despite what you're confronted by, how you are accused. And the fourth thought would be, you might be forgotten. Oh, and we can't allow that to break us, right? Because of course he finds himself in jail. He interprets the chief baker and the chief butler's dreams, and he asks them, he specifically asked them to remember me when you go before the king, and they forget him. And then finally, the one thing, we really need to start thinking about is you will always need assistance to get to where you need to go. You can't do it by yourself. It sounds good. You hear people all the time talking about, oh, I'm gonna pull myself up by my bootstraps, this, that, and the third. What we learn in this moment or in this particular text is, it took the chief butler remembering his experience with Joseph in prison to speak on his behalf while he had the king's attention. And so, lo and behold, he shares what happens with him, and he informs the king there is someone who can interpret your dream. And lo and behold, that's how he gets before the king. And I'm sure all of us have had these moments where friends, even maybe just professional associates, have spoke on our behalf and have gotten us an audience with a decision maker. And that's what I want to plant in your spirit today. Those 5 things. You have to keep your heart, you have to keep your dream in your heart and in your mind. Despite the seasons changing and circumstances, you have to stay focused. And number 3, you might be lied upon or mistreated. For you might be forgotten, and a promise might be broken. And finally, you will need to gain or obtain assistance from others to position you to be in front of the king or a decision maker. How do you get an audience with the king? Let us still our hearts. God, we know that you are in the business of offering up your loving kindness. Oh, Lord, but we also know because of our affiliation with you, there's a peace that will be provided in our walks day to day. Lord, there are some prayer concerns that are here in the midst. And so in this hour, in this moment in time, we ask that you consider those. I have no idea, but you do in the spaces that are reflected in this communication. And so, God, what we ask you to do is to pause, stop at those addresses or in those spaces that we all find ourselves in. Come into the place and boldly release your loving kindness and your peace, and sustain us through whatever season we find ourselves in. Lord, you know the prayer. Someone is making a decision about a job. Someone is making a decision about going back to grad school or sending their child off to undergraduate. Someone is preparing to graduate from high school, from college, and has anxiety about the job or jobs, or the best fit of a job. Lord, plant your spirit there. Plant your spirit there. Provide the wisdom and the perspective. And Lord, remind us always where we find ourselves is today. That doesn't necessarily mean that's a permanent place for us regarding tomorrow. Thank you for your affirming love. Thank you for the gift of life. Thank you for the possibilities that are happening in the life of our university, as well as our organization. And thank you for the friends that are supporting our institution. And thank you for all that you do, God. We offer up these words of praise and petition. Amen. Once again, it has been a blessing to be with you all. We say thank you for pausing and parking your attention right here once again. As always, we always ask that you subscribe to the YouTube station. We also ask that you keep asking, keep seeking, and keep knocking, because the God we serve is not in the business of having a deaf ear to your particular concerns. Be blessed. We look forward to seeing you right back here, same time, same place next week. Be blessed.